In the scorching vastness of the Egyptian desert, when the sun punishes the earth with its relentless fire, the ancients say it is possible to hear the distant roar of a goddess thirsty for blood. Sekhmet, the mighty, the uncontrollable manifestation of Ra's fury, may well be the first vampire humanity ever knew, a divine creature who would prove to be as dangerous as the very sun that gave her life. In this video, you will discover how an Egyptian goddess created to punish humanity nearly caused its complete annihilation in a bloody ritual that echoed through the millennia as the possible origin of vampire legends. By the end of this journey, you will understand why Sekhmet can be considered the first vampire in history, not a creature of the shadows, but a solar predator whose thirst for blood could only be quenched through a divine deception. Sekhmet's story begins in a primordial Egypt, where chaos and order constantly battled for control of the cosmos. Ra, the supreme sun god, reigned over the ordered universe he had created, but his power was beginning to be challenged by rebellious and insolent humans. The insubordination of mortals spread like weeds across the fertile Nile Valley, as they began to neglect the offerings and rituals owed to the gods who had granted them prosperity and protection. Infuriated by human ingratitude, Ra decided to draw from his divine eye a physical manifestation of his burning wrath. Thus was born Sekhmet, the Mighty One, a goddess with the head of a lioness and the body of a woman, cloaked in scarlet red like the blood she would soon spill. Unlike other Egyptian deities who maintained some balance between creation and destruction, Sekhmet was forged with a single purpose: to be the instrument of divine retribution against rebellious humanity. Sekhmet's nature was as fierce as her leonine form suggested, merciless, domineering, and thirsting for conflict. She carried within her divine core the searing heat of the desert and the ferocity of a sandstorm. The hieroglyphs describe her as "she before whom evil trembles, the lady of the brilliant red," and "she who dominates the deserts," titles that reflected both her power and the atmosphere of terror. Her mere presence inspired immortals who dared to defy divine order. Armed with poisoned arrows that brought disease and death, Sekhmet descended to earth not as a benevolent deity to be worshipped, but as a relentless executioner whose thirst for vengeance could only be quenched through bloodshed on a devastating scale. What humans did not yet know was that Sekhmet's fury, once unleashed, would prove uncontrollable even by Ra himself, a divine storm that would soon threaten to wipe all of human creation from the face of the earth. When Sekhmet was unleashed upon the land of men, the sky turned red, a harbinger of the horror that was to come. The lion-headed goddess descended upon Egypt not as a mere executioner, but as an unrelenting force of nature, a storm of blood and divine fury. Her eyes, described in ancient papyri as burning embers of the desert, locked onto her prey with the precision of a born huntress, while her claws tore through mortal flesh as effortlessly as the wind scatters sand. The first to feel her wrath were the conspirators who had plotted to rebel against Ra. But Sekhmet's thirst for blood knew no boundaries of guilt or innocence. Soon, entire villages were reduced to fields of carnage as the goddess advanced methodically from one settlement to the next, leaving behind a trail of mutilated bodies and scorched lands. Some funerary texts describe how Sekhmet tread upon the blood of men and drank from the red flood she herself had created, turning the once fertile fields of the Nile into a macabre feast to satisfy her insatiable thirst. But it was what happened next that transformed Sekhmet into something beyond a mere divine enforcer. The goddess discovered that the taste of human blood brought her an intoxicating pleasure, a near narcotic ecstasy that made her crave more and more. Each drop she consumed fueled not only her power, but also a primal and savage dependency that soon spiraled beyond even Ra's control. Ancient accounts describe how she drank blood at night and hunted again at dawn, establishing a perpetual cycle of predation that threatened to continue until not a single human being remained alive. The massacre reached such proportions that, according to myth, the waters of the sacred Nile ran red for days, while the sound of screams gave way to the oppressive silence of mass death. It was in this critical moment that Ra began to realize the terrible mistake he had made. His instrument of punishment had become an autonomous force of total destruction, whose thirst for blood seemed to grow with every life it took, threatening to completely wipe out the very humanity the sun god had merely intended to discipline. Beholding the relentless massacre his creation was unleashing, Ra was overtaken by a feeling unprecedented for a supreme deity regret. Humanity, though flawed and rebellious, was his precious creation, and Sekhmet, in her blood-soaked frenzy, now threatened to annihilate every last trace of the human race. The cries of the survivors reached the heavens like desperate pleas, begging for divine mercy that seemed never to come. As the lioness goddess continued her merciless hunt, no longer driven by divine mandate, but by her own insatiable thirst for blood, Ra then summoned a council of gods to find a solution to the problem he himself had created. Thoth, the god of wisdom, proposed a clever stratagem that would exploit Sekhmet's newfound dependence, a plan that would not attempt to defeat her by force, since no mortal or immortal power seemed capable of stopping her directly, but rather would manipulate her recently developed compulsion for human blood. The gods ordered the preparation of 7,000 jars of beer, into which they mixed red ochre and mandrake, giving the beverage the appearance and some of the scent of human blood, while imbuing it with potent narcotic properties strong enough to affect even a deity. On the eve of what would have been yet another day of massacre, servants of the gods poured this mixture over the lands Sekhmet intended to devastate at dawn. When the first light of morning touched the horizon and the bloodthirsty goddess awoke to resume her slaughter, she found the fields flooded with what appeared to be a sea of fresh blood, more abundant than any feast she had encountered before. Without hesitation, Sekhmet threw herself upon the liquid, drinking greedily what she believed to be the blood of thousands of victims already slain by some other force. Perhaps another god seeking to steal the pleasure of the hunt from her. As she consumed liters of the crimson potion, the narcotic effects of the beer began to take hold of her divine body. Her vision blurred, her steps grew unsteady, and the murderous instinct that had guided her gave way to a disoriented euphoria. The fierce Sekhmet, who just hours earlier had roared while tearing through human bodies, now stumbled across the fields, laughing uncontrollably, until she finally succumbed to a deep sleep induced by the powerful alcoholic mixture. While she slept, her warrior spirit was gradually transmuted by the divine magic contained within the drink, in a process that would forever change her fundamental nature. When Sekhmet finally awoke from her induced slumber, a profound transformation had taken place within her divine essence. The uncontrollable fury that once consumed her gave way to a new awareness. She was no longer solely the goddess of destruction, but now also carried the potential for healing and protection. The Egyptians came to know her under a new aspect. Sekhmet, the Mighty One, had also become she who knows diseases, an ambivalent deity capable of both spreading plagues and curing them at will. This duality reflected the Egyptian understanding of cosmic forces. That which can destroy also possesses the power to restore and preserve. Sekhmet's priests became the first doctors of ancient Egypt, scholars of anatomy and medicinal herbs, who sought to understand the mysteries of the human body in order to combat the very afflictions their goddess could inflict or heal. In her temples, elaborate rituals were performed daily to appease her warrior spirit and invoke her benevolent aspects for protection against the diseases that plagued the Nile Valley. The priest-physicians whispered incantations in her name as they prepared healing potions, calling upon she who knows the secrets of blood and life to guide their hands during complex medical procedures. Despite this transformation, Sekhmet's vampiric aspect never entirely disappeared. The goddess remained deeply connected to blood and its vital power, merely redirecting her thirst toward a more constructive purpose. During annual ceremonies held in her honor, priests offered cups of red wine symbolizing human blood, a constant reminder of the unspoken pact between humanity and the predatory goddess. As long as she received her ritual offerings, her fury would remain dormant. This symbiotic relationship between worshippers and deity established one of the earliest documented examples of the vampiric archetype in ancient cultures. A powerful being whose thirst for blood could be channeled through specific rituals. The Egyptians understood that Sekhmet could never truly be tamed. Her fundamental nature remained wild and dangerous, requiring constant appeasement through elaborate daily rites. In her annual festival, known as the Festival of Drunkenness, thousands of jars of beer, dyed red, were offered to the goddess, reenacting the divine deception that had once saved humanity and reminding all of the delicate balance between life and death that Sekhmet represented. This festival celebrated not only the salvation of humankind, but also the birth of a new understanding of divine duality, that the same force capable of bringing destruction was also able to offer protection to those who honored it properly. In the temples dedicated to Sekhmet, built along the banks of the Nile and near the arid edges of the desert, one of the most complex and rigorous cult systems of ancient Egypt was developed. The statue of the goddess, usually carved from black stone or red granite, occupied the central sanctuary, an imposing leonine figure with gemstone inlaid eyes that seemed to follow every movement of the worshippers. Before this representation, priests dressed in lion skins and feline masks performed elaborate daily rituals, always at dawn, when Ra's power began to manifest on the horizon, reinforcing the intimate connection between Sekhmet and the scorching sun that fueled her fiery, predatory nature. The central element of these rituals was blood offerings, not necessarily human, but preferably from red bulls, which were considered earthly manifestations of the bull god Apis himself. This sacrificial blood was collected in alabaster or gold vessels, mixed with red wine and specific herbs, and then offered to the goddess as a preventive appeasement for her eternal thirst. In the hieroglyphs describing these ceremonies, passages can be found that mention how the mouth of the Mighty One is satisfied with the red essence of life, indicating that blood was not only symbolic, but a literal substance essential to maintaining cosmic order through the contentment of the vampiric goddess. During epidemics or times of crisis, the rituals intensified drastically, with processions of priests passing through afflicted villages carrying effigies of Sekhmet while chanting incantations to drive away the 7 arrows of disease. The sick were brought to the temples for purification rituals where their blood was examined by priest physicians who believed they could diagnose imbalances by observing its color, consistency, and behavior when mixed with different substances. This practice established some of the earliest forms of hematological diagnosis in history, though enveloped in the mysticism and religious symbolism characteristic of the time. It is fascinating to note that Egyptian medical texts described blood circulation millennia before William Harvey formally defined the concept the medical papyri attribute to Sekhmet, the knowledge of the path of the red waters that nourish the body, a surprisingly accurate description of the circulatory system. It was believed that the goddess, during her bloodthirsty frenzy, had developed an intimate understanding of human anatomy and the secrets of blood, later transmitting this knowledge to her chosen priests through visions and prophetic dreams. Thus, Egyptian medical practice, one of the most advanced in the ancient world, was intrinsically linked to the worship of this vampiric deity, forming a fascinating intersection between early science and blood-based mysticism. Sekhmet's duality as mistress of both disease and healing represents one of the most intriguing paradoxes of Egyptian theology. After her partial transformation, the lioness goddess came to bear the title "She Who Knows Poisons and Their Antidotes," establishing a revolutionary medical concept for the ancient world. The idea that the very substance which causes harm can, in the right dosage and preparation, become the remedy for that same harm. This sophisticated understanding is reflected in Egyptian medical papyri, where precise instructions are found for extracting, preparing, and administering substances which, in excessive amounts, would be lethal, but in controlled doses, became powerful healing agents. Sekhmet's temples functioned as the first teaching hospitals of civilization, where apprentices underwent decades of rigorous training to master not only anatomical and pharmaceutical knowledge, but also the complex invocations required to channel the goddess's healing aspect. In these sanctuaries of healing, patients underwent an initial ritual in which their blood was symbolically tasted by the goddess through a ceremony in which a drop was placed in the mouth of Sekhmet's statue. It was believed this allowed the deity to know the specific nature of the illness afflicting the supplicant, and thus guide the priest-physicians in administering the appropriate treatment for each individual case. The relationship between Sekhmet and blood transcended mere vampiric symbolism, reaching a proto-scientific understanding of this vital fluid's role in the body. The medical texts mention how the breath of life travels in the red rivers that Sekhmet knows, a strikingly accurate reference to the oxygen transport function performed by hemoglobin. Even more impressive are descriptions of tiny boats that sail the Red River carrying the vital force, a possible allusion to red blood cells, perhaps observed through some rudimentary method of magnification or intuited through careful observation of blood behavior under different pathological conditions. The hematological knowledge attributed to Sekhmet manifested in therapeutic practices such as the purification of the blood through divine fire, treatments involving the controlled application of heat to specific areas of the body to stimulate circulation in regions affected by disease or injury. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated instruments used in these procedures, including small metal rods with variously shaped tips, each designed for a specific form of thermal treatment. This mastery of heat as a therapeutic agent reinforced Sekhmet's association with the solar fire of Ra, establishing a symbolic continuity between her origin as the flaming wrath of the sun god and her later transformation into a healing deity through the precise control of that same primordial fire. In comparative mythological analysis, Sekhmet stands out as a unique archetype that defies the conventional categorizations of traditional vampirism that would emerge millennia later. Unlike nocturnal creatures that fear sunlight, Sekhmet is, essentially, the first solar vampire in mythological history, a being whose power is amplified by the presence of the sun reaching its peak at midday. When Ra stands at his zenith in the Egyptian sky, this fundamental inversion of the later vampiric paradigm suggests a fascinating evolution in humanity's supernatural narratives, where the primordial fear lay not in the shadows of night, but in the merciless desert light that consumed lives as easily as did the goddess's bloodthirst. The hieroglyphs related to Sekhmet often describe her as she who drinks the vital essence and grows stronger, clearly establishing the concept of an entity that draws power through the consumption of blood, the fundamental definition of vampirism in any cultural context. In protection rituals against disease, the Egyptians recited formulas that described how the blood offered to the Mighty One diverts her thirst from the bodies of the living, explicitly articulating the idea of sacrificial substitution that would later appear in various cultures as a method to appease vampiric entities. This transactional relationship with a bloodthirsty deity sets the basic model for what would later be codified in the vampire legends of many civilizations. Statuettes of Sekhmet, found in tombs, often featured small embedded vessels intended to hold liquid offerings, typically red wine symbolizing blood. These artifacts were accompanied by inscriptions asking the goddess to drink from the offering and not from the vital fluids of the deceased, revealing a fear that the deity's bloodlust might manifest even in the realm of the dead. This concern for post-mortem physical integrity echoes the later anti-vampire funerary practices found in numerous cultures, where specific measures were taken to prevent the corpse from rising to consume the blood of the living. A fascinating structural parallel that suggests a continuity of belief in blood-drinking entities across the millennia. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the connection between Sekhmet and later vampirism is the way her thirst for blood is described as an uncontrollable compulsion, not merely a desire, but an existential need that would later define the vampiric condition. Texts describe how, even after her partial pacification, Sekhmet requires the red offerings to keep her nature in balance, establishing the crucial concept of insatiable hunger as a defining trait of vampiric entities. This transcendental hunger, which surpasses mere nutrition to become an ontological condition of the vampiric being, laid the foundation for all subsequent mythology, where the vampire is eternally defined by the endless pursuit of blood, a pursuit that began in the scorching sands of Egypt with the unquenchable thirst of a lioness goddess. The echo of Sekhmet's bloodthirst reverberated across the millennia, manifesting in various cultures that had never had direct contact with ancient Egypt. In the Mesopotamian legends of Lamashtu, we encounter a female deity with a lion's head who attacked pregnant women and newborns to drink their blood's structural similarities, far too specific to be mere coincidence. Likewise, the Hindu goddess Kali, in her most blood-soaked aspects, mirrors Sekhmet's duality as both destroyer and protector, often depicted holding a chalice in which she collects the blood of decapitated demons. These cross-cultural manifestations suggest that the vampiric archetype established by Sekhmet touched something deeply rooted in the human collective unconscious, a primordial fear tied to blood as a sacred substance and the divine predator that consumes it. When Christianity began to take hold in Egypt, it absorbed elements of Sekhmet's cult into its local practices, particularly in regard to Eucharistic symbolism. In the earliest Coptic communities, we find references to the transformation of wine into divine blood, which the faithful consumed for spiritual protection, an inverted parallel to the appeasement rituals of Sekhmet, where now it was the worshippers who drank divine blood, rather than the deity who drank human blood. This fascinating inversion kept the subconscious memory of the vampiric goddess alive, transposing her into a new theological context that preserved her symbolic essence through the ages. The Islamic incursion into Egypt, centuries later, did not entirely erase the legends tied to Sekhmet. In medieval Arabic folklore from Cairo, references appear to a lion-headed female entity that roamed the desert during sandstorms, thirsty for the blood of unsuspecting travelers. Locally known as Al-Sekhmet, a clear phonetic derivation of Sekhmet, this creature was described as a servant of the scorching heat who can only be repelled by pouring red wine into the sand, preserving not only the ancient goddess's name, but also the traditional method of appeasement through the offering of a liquid that mimicked human blood. In the modern era, Sekhmet has transcended her cultural specificity to become a universal archetype that continues to fascinate and inspire. From Anne Rice to countless other contemporary authors, the concept of the solar vampire, a creature whose thirst for blood is tied to the power of the sun, not the shadows of night, finds literary and artistic expression that traces back, consciously or unconsciously, to the ancient Egyptian goddess. When we contemplate the evolution of vampirism as a cultural construct, from its earliest manifestations to its contemporary incarnations, it becomes evident that Sekhmet remains the primordial matrix of this mythological lineage, the first divine entity to embody the defining vampiric triad, an insatiable thirst for human blood, supernatural power tied to that thirst, and the possibility of appeasement through specific rituals that redirect the hunger towards symbolic substitutes for vital blood. As the eternal sands of Egypt continue to be swept by the winds of time, Sekhmet's name has never been silenced. She is not merely a relic of a forgotten faith, nor a symbol of extinct mythology. She is an ancestral scar, a living reminder that the gods, no matter how distant they may seem, are reflections of humanity's most visceral passions. The thirst for blood that shaped her existence is not a deviation, it is a revelation, a mythological mirror that exposes the extremes between punishment and redemption, destruction and healing, shadows and light. Sekhmet is not the enemy of humanity. She is its rawest, fiercest, most honest reflection. As Anne Rice wrote in The Queen of the Damned, the thirst for blood is more than biology, it is soul. It is what moves us in the shadows. And Sekhmet, with her solar nature, proves that even light can be ravenous. In modern vampire legends, the night shelters the predators. But in Sekhmet, we find the exception that shapes the archetype, a solar vampire, direct daughter of celestial fire, who walks in the light as an immortal huntress. She does not hide in the darkness, she incinerates it, The association of blood with power, medical knowledge, and the cycle of life and death, all of this already existed in her rituals long before the names of Dracula, Carmilla, or Akasha were ever whispered. What the centuries have done is merely recycle a primordial fear that among the gods, or within ourselves, exists a thirst that can only be quenched through the other, through the vital, through the sacred that flows in our veins. Sekhmet reminds us that the first vampire was not undead, but a living, powerful, and terrifying goddess. And it is this understanding that must echo after the end of this journey. Sekhmet is more than a myth. She is a genetic code of fear, the fear of being punished for defying the gods, the fear of being consumed by something we ourselves helped create, but also the hope that even the most voracious entities can be appeased, that there is redemption even within fury. That thirst, when recognized and understood, can be transformed into wisdom. As the story of the ancient Egyptians teaches us, rituals do not merely protect us from the divine, they remind us of who we are in the face of the divine. So the next time you hear of vampires, remember, before the castles in Transylvania, before crucifixes and wooden stakes, before the night and the bats, there was the desert. There was Sekhmet. And she did not drink in the shadows. She drank beneath the sun.